For the last 30 years, the United States of America has enjoyed an uncontested hegemony over the world. Since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, no great power has come close to unseating the US as the sole superpower of the world. All that is changing. The world itself is changing right before our eyes. Now in the year 2023, American hegemony is being challenged more fiercely and successfully by the union of China and Russia than the Soviet Union could ever wish for. As people are becoming more aware of this reality, it's fair to say that a new Cold War is on the horizon, one which will be focused in East Asia and on China as the main adversary. Precisely for this reason, South Korea and Japan, for their proximity and power, will play a decisive role in this new great power confrontation. But there's only one problem. They don't like each other at all. When both countries think of each other, they think of the past, of their bitter and devastating recent history. This history, not even 100 years old, has developed animosity, not resolved past grievances. For that reason, this relationship can be defined by one word: distrust. I want to share with you a fascinating story of two countries who need to heal the wounds of the past so that they can meet the challenges of the present to secure a prosperous future. This is the story of South Korea and Japan.
Just a day and a half by steamer across the Yellow Sea lay Japan. Here, the God Emperor and his fanatic warlords were using this same Western civilization for one purpose and only one: to create one of the world's most powerful war machines.
History has haunted South Korea and Japan relations. Therefore, we need to go back in time to better understand how this all started to go wrong. The 19th century is where we must start, for this is when the relationship changed irrevocably. As Japan and Korea lived in splendid isolation, tranquility spread throughout their lands. But that tranquility would be disturbed by an outside world, which was changing, and was intent on forcing that change upon them. The winds of change arrived on the shores of Asia, and the fate of nations would be decided. But the first to be encroached upon was the Qing Empire of China, which was in a fierce clash with the British over legal opium. Originally, the British sought to open up China to foreign trade. However, the British had nothing to offer, for the Qing had no need for any European goods, and only accepted silver. The British then were emptying their coffers to the delight of the Qing court. Suffering from a debilitating trade imbalance, the British conspired to smuggle highly addictive opium into China. This highly destructive supply of opium wreaked havoc on Chinese society and culminated in the First Opium War from 1839 to 1842, where the Chinese were soundly defeated. The defeat led to the first of many unequal treaties, where the more powerful side imposed unfair and harsh conditions on the weaker nation. These events would have a lasting memory for the Chinese, as we shall see later on in the story. The events in China foreshadowed a similar fate for Korea and Japan, as the imperial Western powers looked to open them up as well. Korea regarded China as the home of civilization, even if it was currently under the rule of barbarian Manchus. The rare and limited channels of communication to China would reveal to the hermit kingdom of the horrifying ways in which the once glorious land of Confucius was being humiliated by foreign invaders. Japan, who was under the rule of a military government known as the Tokugawa shogunate, were also deeply troubled by these events. Mizuno Tadakuni, a senior counselor at the time, had this to say: "This is happening in a foreign country, but I believe it also contains a warning for us." Tadakuni knew that the Western imperial powers would not stop at China, and he was right. In 1853, the American naval officer Matthew Perry finally succeeded in opening up Japan to trade. Over 200 years of peaceful isolation would come to a dramatic end when an almost identical treaty that was signed with the Chinese was drawn with the Japanese. The significance of these events cannot be overstated. The shogunate would be weakened, and the Emperor of Japan would be restored to power. Japan was not only going to modernize, but transform itself in a relatively short duration into an imperial world power on the edge of Asia. Perhaps the best explanation provided of this transformation can be attributed to Inoue Kaoru, the Japanese foreign minister who in 1887 said, "What we must do is to transform our empire and our people. Make the empire like the countries of Europe, and our people like the peoples of Europe. To put it differently, we have to establish a new European-style empire on the edge of Asia." It was this fundamental shift in mindset that led otherwise a peaceful coexistence into Japan trying to conquer its neighbors. Japanese statesmen were principally concerned with trying to find an answer to their vulnerabilities vulnerable position. They witnessed the aggressive nature of European powers, who had decade after decade successfully encroached on Asia for their own gain. Their answer to that problem, which concentrated the intellectual minds of this island nation, was to become just like the aggressor. They were intent on fighting fire with fire, as they did not want to reach the dreadful position of a subservient nation. Thus, the Empire of Japan was born. Starting in 1868 with the Meiji Restoration, for the next nearly 8 decades, Japan would embrace an expansionist policy, seeking complete hegemony in Asia. From the very beginning, Japan showed signs of aggression. Korea, due to its geographical proximity, was prone to that aggression from the start. After an armed confrontation near the Gungwa Island in 1876, a Japanese victory forced Korea to trade with foreign powers. Korea was forced open from its isolation, just as Japan was by the US. Japan managed to achieve victory after victory against its enemies, first against the Qing Empire in 1895, then against the Russian Empire in 1905, which shocked the world and introduced Japan as a great power. With no real threat remaining in Asia, Japan formally annexed Korea in 1910. Throughout the 1930s and into World War II, Japan would go on to conquer Manchuria, parts of China, and much of Asia. But by August 1945, US victory in the Pacific foiled all plans of conquest for the Empire of Japan. After 2 atomic bombs being dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, it was decisively defeated by the United States. As Japan was made to change from within by the US in 1853, all those years ago, it was to do the same when it was defeated in 1945. Defeat meant it was to be a part of a new international order, led by the US and allied powers, which set out to create a global, rules-based system which enforced international cooperation through newly established institutions such as the United Nations. Japan was thus forced to go from an expansionist imperial power to a constitutional monarchy, where in its new constitution it renounced its right to declare war. This astonishing reversal in fate would oblige Japan to deal with its neighbors through diplomacy rather than war, and this meant rectifying past injustices peacefully. These injustices have carried on into the present day. For example, Japanese atrocities during the colonial period in Korea from 1910 to 1945 are still remembered and impair the relationship. Japan forced Koreans to work in mines and factories. Under brutal conditions, hundreds of thousands of Koreans were forced to build the Japanese imperial war machine, and if they weren't working, they were to be enlisted for wars of conquest all over Asia. In addition to this, thousands of women were forced into sexual slavery. They became euphemistically known as comfort women. These acts of barbarism are the principal grievances levied towards Japan, and the inability to heal past wounds impede a positive relationship in the present day. The relationship between Japan and South Korea since the end of World War II remained turbulent, but things were mostly kept stable by larger geopolitical realities such as the Cold War. But when the Cold War ended in 1991, it ushered in a new era of insecurity. Initially, it was masked in a triumphant Western world order, which South Korea and Japan were a part of. But the upswing in bilateral relations was fleeting, as they would soon go into a downward spiral. This started in the 2000s, when the old structures of the Cold War subsided and memory politics were in full swing. East Asian countries had their own form of memory politics they were dealing with. South Korea did not want to be in the shadow of Japan, and revisited the legitimacy and scope of the 1965 agreement. China was self-conscious of a century of humiliation, and was well on its way to becoming a superpower. And Japan was frustrated with being eclipsed by China and sought its own resurgence. And then we mustn't forget North Korea, who inherited the Korean legacy of the Hermit Kingdom, as it would become one of the most isolated countries in the world. To rectify its dangerously isolated position, it sought nuclear weapons and eventually would acquire them. Both countries have tremendous reasons to join together and cooperate fully on the China and North Korea problems, for they have the most reason to, as the aggressor is right in their neighborhood. But as much sense as it makes for these two countries to come together, not only has the opposite happened, but the lowest point in relations was reached in 2018. The root cause of this deterioration stems from the colonial period, but not only that. It's the perception that Japan has not sufficiently apologized and amended its ties with South Korea that hurt bilateral relations. Resentment set in towards Japan. Decades of time have accumulated for that resentment to grow, and finally it manifested itself in the disaster, the lowest point, of 2018 to 2022. It all started with the South Korean Supreme Court ruling, which ordered the Japanese companies of Nippon Steel and Sumitomo Metal Corp and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries to compensate wartime forced workers. An exchange of disputes led to a downward spiral over the next 4 years. The original problem multiplied into individual disputes, which are carried together in a larger antagonism founded in deep historical grievances. At the heart of the issue is the feeling that Japan has already compensated South Korea, whether it be the 1965 Treaty on Basic Relations, which saw Japan give $300 million to South Korea and thought it resolved the matter fully, or the 2015 agreement which settled the comfort women issue. So from Japan's perspective, the 2018 Supreme Court ruling is seen as just another sign that no real meaningful reconciliation can be reached. As for South Korea, it's a sign of inadequacy and insincerity. The two decisions of forced labor and restriction of exports key to South Korea's electronics industry set the stage for a never-ending downward spiral in bilateral relations. The deep nature of the problem became evidently clear when in 2018, during an international fleet review, Japanese self-defense forces were prohibited from flying its official flag, the Rising Sun. More significantly, the Koreans were flying the flag of Admiral Yi Sun-sin, a Korean hero who in 1592 had defeated the Japanese army's invasion of Korea. This happened despite rules that only national flags can be flown, showing the historical portion of the dispute. It seemed that these two countries were just not ever going to get along, that the issues were personal, especially for South Korea, when President Moon proclaimed in 2019 that we will never again lose to Japan. Distrust so perfectly describes this relationship, and once that distrust sets in, it becomes nearly impossible to get along with the other party. And it seemed that these two countries were just never going to get along. The distrust was instinctual now, and Japan thought trying to reconcile was pointless. The message is now clear: South Korea and Japan just don't get along. At the bottom of the endless pit of darkness and despair, there was hope. Hope for the future. What once looked bleak started to look optimistic. What encouraged that hope? One man. One man has changed the course of history. His name is Yoon Suk-yeol, the 13th president of South Korea. President Yoon, when he assumed office on May 10th, 2022, would go on to become the man responsible for this astonishing reversal in fate. He decided to sacrifice domestic politics for a better future for both countries. This was encouraged and supported by a new administration in the US that seek to actively resurrect relations. This combined effort led to a leader's statement in Phnom Penh by the US, Japan, and South Korea. It was the first step in the beginning of a new era, away from the darkness of prior years. This led for the first time in 12 years, in March of 2023, a bilateral summit in Tokyo, with President Yoon alongside his counterpart, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida of Japan. Less than 2 weeks before this historic meeting, President Yoon made a paradigm-shifting move to resolve the forced labor issue. Progress, which for decades had been impossible, was happening right before our eyes. Of course, this move drew backlash for Yoon, and it must be emphasized the political willpower, prudence, and sacrifice of domestic politics that he's making. A real concession was made when on March 6, Yoon's administration announced that it would use domestic funds to compensate the damages to the victims of forced labor. This was the opening move, which showed Japan that South Korea was serious about mending ties. Again in May, the second meeting between the leaders in less than 2 months saw one side say that finally the two are moving forward and attempting to build a future-oriented relationship. Then we witnessed the historic trilateral meeting at Camp David on August 18th, 2023. It was the first time the three countries were met specifically for trilateral discussion and not just on occasion. The summit provided a roadmap for the three countries to strengthen and coordinate in areas where there is convergence, such as economic and military ties. The goal was to institutionalize trilateral ties. This is because as much as there's unity in values and agreement in the threat of China, it all has the possibility of falling apart due to those deep historical grievances. Problems are mounting, and it's fair to see the historical failures and say no meaningful reconciliation will be achieved. And if not now, when? When has there been a more appropriate time to reconcile past differences and unite for the cause which is greater than the both of them? Despite this, just recently, December 21st of 2023, South Korea's top court upheld the 2018 verdict, ordering Japan to compensate forced workers, despite Yoon's attempts to create a fund with South Korean money. And this happened right before South Korea and Japan would resume high-level economic meetings, something which hasn't happened in nearly 8 years. Japan protested, but the meeting went on. Both countries agreed to realize their full potential in economic cooperation. This is a sign that despite adversity, protests, and domestic politics, the two countries, South Korea under Yoon Suk-yeol and Japan under Fumio Kishida, can continue to work together for a positive future. With a diplomatic thaw, a long cold winter could be coming to an end. With the world further slipping into a new era of insecurity, the winds of change have come once again to East Asia. History tells us that every country and leader will be faced with difficult decisions in times of change. To stick with the prevailing way, what has been and what ought to remain the same, or to adapt to the new and different, will be consequential for a people's survival and ultimate prosperity. That moment in history has arrived again, knocking on the doors of nations, asking, which way will you go?